So there's a lot of chaos going on in the economy. In fact, as I'm talking to you right now, apparently the market is falling off of a cliff. Not surprising, since everything seems to be a scam in today's day and age. Well, the Fed Chair Jerome Powell, he of course has been hiking interest rates a lot in recent months. And there was a hearing in front of the Senate, and he kind of got hammered and pummeled and taken to task for raising interest rates because of his explicitly stated goal in doing so. His explicitly stated goal in raising interest rates is, hey, we need to massively increase unemployment by millions of people in order to get inflation under control. That's what they said. That's not Kyle Kulinski's spin on it. That's what they said. So now you're going to have Elizabeth Warren go, excuse you? So your stated goal is to get millions more people unemployed? That seems like a terrible goal if you ask me. And what if that happens, but you also don't improve inflation in the process? What about that? So great line of questioning here. Take a look.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the Fed has raised interest rates 8 times over the last year in what has been the most extreme rate hike cycle in 40 years. The Fed's goal is to slow inflation, and your tool, raising interest rates, is designed to slow the economy and throw people out of work. So far, you haven't tipped the economy into recession, but you haven't brought inflation entirely under control either. And maybe the reason for that is that other things are also keeping prices high, things you can't fix with high interest rates, things like price gouging and supply chain kinks and a war in Ukraine. But you are determined to continue to raise interest rates, so I want to take a look at where you're headed. In December, the Fed released its projections on the state of the economy under your monetary policy plan. According to the Fed's own report, if you continue raising interest rates as you plan, unemployment will be 4.6% by the end of the year, more than a full point higher than it is today. Chair Powell, if you hit your projections, do you know how many people who are currently working, going about their lives, will lose their jobs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I will say it's not an intended consequence.
But it is, and it's in your report, and that would be about 2 million people who would lose their jobs, people who are working right now, making their mortgages. So, Chair Powell, if you could speak directly to the 2 million hardworking people who have decent jobs today, who you're planning to get fired over the next year, what would you say to them? How would you explain your view that they need to lose their jobs?
I would explain to people more broadly that inflation is extremely high and it's hurting the working people of this country badly. All of them, not just 2 million of them, but all of them are suffering under high inflation. And we are taking the only measures we have to bring inflation down.
And putting 2 million people out of work is just part of the cost, and they just have to bear it?
Well, will working people be better off if we just walk away from our jobs and inflation remains 5-6%?
Let me ask you about what happens if you do this. Since the end of World War II, there have been 12 times in which the unemployment rate has increased by 1 percentage point within 1 year, exactly what you're aiming to do right now. How many of those times did the U.S. economy avoid falling into a recession?
You know, it's not as black and white as very,
just
very
looking at the numbers. It actually is pretty black
Alan
and white.
Blinder's written a book on this.
There have been 12 times that we've seen a 1 point increase in the unemployment rate in a year. That's exactly what your Fed report has put out as the projection and the plan based on how you're going to keep raising these interest rates. How many times did the economy fail to fall into a recession after doing that? Out of 12 times.
I think the number is 0.
I think the number is 0. That's exactly right. So then the question becomes, we've got 2 million people out of work. Can you stop it at 2 million people? History suggests that the Fed has a terrible track record of containing modest increases in the unemployment rate. Once the economy starts shedding jobs, it's kind of like a runaway train. It is really hard to stop. In fact, in 11 out of the 12 times that the unemployment rate increased by a full percentage point within 1 year, unemployment went on to rise another full percentage point on top of that. If that's what happens this time, we'd be looking at least 3.5 million people who would lose their jobs. So, Chair Powell, if you reach your goal and 2 million people get laid off by the end of this year, and then, just like in 11 out of 12 times that unemployment has risen by a point in a single year, it keeps on rising. And then we've got 2.5 million people out of work. We've got 3 million people who get laid off. We've got 3.5 million people who get laid off. What's your plan?
Well, right now the unemployment rate is 3.4%, which is the lowest in 54 years. And we actually don't think that we need to see a sharp or enormous increase in unemployment to get inflation under control.
I'm looking at your projections. Do you call laying off 2 million people this year not a sharp increase in
I would say
unemployment?
4.5%.
Explain that to the 2 million families who are going to be out of work.
We're not targeting any of that. But I would say even 4.5% unemployment is well better than most of the time for the last 75 years.
In other words, you don't have a plan to stop a runaway train if it occurs. Chair Powell, you are gambling with people's lives, and there's a pile of data showing that price gouging and supply chain kinks and the war in Ukraine are driving up prices. You cling to the idea that there's only one solution: lay off millions of workers. We need a Fed that will fight for families. And if you're not going to lead that charge, we need someone at the Fed who will.
Damn, son. That's a little flash of old school Elizabeth Warren, if you ask me. Back before we all despised her for a plethora of reasons. Wow. She nailed him to the wall on that one. So the key points there are this. What if inflation is not something that in this instance can simply be fixed by hiking interest rates? What if that's the case? What then? Then you're making a colossal mistake because you're going to increase unemployment and also not get inflation under control. That's terrible. And she lists the things, and she's correct in this, by the way. There is so much data that price gouging is leading to inflation. That, by the way, tied hand in hand with that is monopolization as well. You have supply chain kinks left over from the pandemic, same thing, and you have the war in Ukraine. So of all those things, by the way, I would argue price gouging is probably the biggest thing that's leading to inflation, because I've read a number of articles that indicate that the media started this narrative of inflation mania, and then a lot of corporations used that as an excuse to jack up prices to make people pay more, even if those particular products were not impacted by inflation. They just raise the prices and say, hey, we can get away with it. There are earnings calls from corporate boards where they admit this. We've had The Intercept get a number of them where they're like, yeah, we're using the whole inflation narrative to just charge people more and make record corporate profits. So if that's the case, just jacking interest rates to get more people unemployed, I mean, that's a terrible idea. Now, look, I think you can make a good argument that you probably needed to raise interest rates to some extent, but where we're at now and the fact that they want to continue going down this path, I don't know, man. And also, what does it say about our economic system if the stated goal of the central bank is we need to push millions more people into poverty? We need to make them unemployed. Millions more people. Well, that means that obviously the system does not care about those millions of people. Doesn't care about working people. And that's not a controversial statement. It's right there in black and white laid out in front of you. Now, I will say Jerome Powell is right about one thing. He says, quote, we're taking the only action we have to get inflation under control. Why does he say that? Because, yeah, the Federal Reserve is limited in the actions that it can take because it's the central bank. It's not Congress. It's not the House or the Senate or the executive branch, the presidency. It's not. It's just the central bank. And so, yeah, they have one blunt instrument that they could use in their toolbox, and so they're using it over and over and over. Now, again, I think it's a mistake how they're going about it, but really, the onus here falls more on the president and on Congress. It just does. Now, I want you to take note of something else, too, because this is super important. Look at the difference between how Jerome Powell talks about working people and what the Fed did when Silicon Valley Bank crashed and Signature Bank crashed. It is a night and day difference, man. It is a night and day difference. When they're talking about working people, yeah, we need to make sure we get millions more people unemployed to get inflation under control. So it's like sacrificing it to the fundamentalist gods of the marketplace. Yeah, millions more people unemployed. Great. Silicon Valley Bank crashes, and they immediately rush in to bail them out. You have the FDIC step in and say, hey, we got this. We're not even going to, $250,000 is supposed to be, that's what you're insured on. But they were like, no, we're going to go above that. And then the Fed jumps in and goes, $300 billion backstop. We're going to make you all totally whole. So for the wealthy and well-connected, the people who have lobbyists, oh my God, they get saved immediately. By the way, a bailout is the opposite of their policy towards working people. They're doing quantitative easing. That's the bailout. So spend for the rich. Nobody says a goddamn word about Oh my God, is this bank bailout $300 billion backstop? Is that going to increase inflation? Nobody said a word about that in corporate media. Nobody said a word about that. Because helping the well-off is categorized in the duh category. Like, what do you mean? That's what we do. We're an oligarchy. We're a kleptocracy. If you're wealthy and well-connected, of course you're going to get some support. We're not going to let you hurt. But those working people, yeah, we want 2 million more of them unemployed. We want to push them into poverty, make them more desperate. Astonishing, man. Absolutely astonishing. I mean, this barely requires any commentary from me, right? It makes my job easy because you could see it in front of your face. I don't need to make these points for you. You already see these points. Bailout all day long. Socialism for the rich. Rugged individualism and capitalism for the poor. That's the gist of it. And again, this is old school, flashes of old school Elizabeth Warren. People forget there was a time when she didn't suck. I mean, she's the one who brought us the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That returned $12 billion to defrauded Americans. So she actually took on wealthy and powerful interests at one time before she totally lost her identity and ran a goofy presidential campaign where she leaned into social issues and stabbed Bernie in the back, and the list goes on and on. But anyway, look, she's right. She's right. The Fed should stop hiking interest rates, and Congress and the president should take action when it comes to price gouging the supply chain. To be fair, on the supply chain, they have done some things, but it's going to take a while before we create all those jobs here. We've already had 300,000 jobs onshored, and they're creating more jobs now with, battery factories, microchip factories, electric vehicle stuff. So like on that front, they are doing something, but they need to do something to crack down on the price gouging because that's the main culprit here. And instead of tackling that, the Fed is just trying to kick working people out of their jobs. If you want to see me and Crystal Ball interview legends like Noam Chomsky, Cornel West, and more, subscribe to Crystal, Kyle, and Friends on Substack. $5 a month gets you the video version a day early. Remember, we take 0 ad dollars for this podcast. Or you can sign up on Substack for free and get the audio version a day later. Link in the video description box below.